This Swansea hedge laying project was organised by Swansea University whilst I was working at Swansea University, and was funded under the National Heritage Lottery Fund for the Copperworks. We chose this piece of land next to Landor Social Club, partly because it was Landor Social Club used to be part of the Copperworks. The building is part of the Victorian extension of the Copperworks. And it was also next to the canal that brought coal into the Copperworks. And this is probably why this hedgerow and coppice were originally planted. The bank is quite steep. It now lies right in the middle of the city, but it would have been on the edge of the city when it was planted. And I think the reason why they planted this coppice and hedgerow where they did was to stabilise the bank, as simple as that. The project consisted of myself and a hedge layer, and 169 local volunteers turned up over a 3-month period, which we had in sort of blocks of about 30, about 4 or 5 local schools and 2 or 3 local colleges, and both of the local universities, so Swansea University and Trinity St David's. The project lasted between October and December of 2019, and during that time we ran somewhere between 16 to 20 different courses, which covered coppicing, hedgerow management, hedge laying, and woodland management. We did both sites, so there's 2 sites of this project. One's at the stadium, where we laid a new hedge, and like I said before, the other site was at Landor Social Club. So why did we do it? Well, we originally came up to see the site in August, and at that time the trees were fully in leaf, and the hazel had grown to approximately 20 metres, something like that, and it was on a steep bank, and for that reason we decided to lay it.
So you can see how big these were. If you have a look into the centre there, most of the trees standing here were sort of like this width, and they were all along this whole sort of like half-acre sort of patch, all sort of 20 metres tall, and everything underneath was completely dead. So the idea really was to bring this coppice back and allow the biodiversity to come back underneath.
When we turned up on site, really there was only 1 or 2 species left on this site, and that is because as hazel grows, and as I said, it's designed to be coppiced every 7 to 10 years. So as it grows, it increasingly cuts out the light for anything that would try and grow beneath. So really you only get kind of fungus and stuff that can kind of take damp and wet conditions that will grow underneath. And in many sort of ancient coppices, what we find is that every 7 to 10 years when they're cut, you get this massive bloom of wild flowers whose seeds are just sitting there, knowing that every 7 to 10 years they're going to get a good 3 years where they get a lot of light, and then the light will be increasingly cut out. And so the seeds just sit in the ground. And there was no real reason to believe that this bank would be any different. And in fact, it hasn't been. So we coppiced this in 2019 and laid the hedge. And since we did that, there's now probably 20 to 30 different species have sort of cropped up. There's obviously hawthorn has come in, and ash, blackthorn, there's some elder, some white rose, some cow parsley can be seen. And this is all by the side of a road. So you can imagine how much more biodiverse this would be if it was in the middle of a woodland.
As ecologists, we are always interested in understanding better how biodiversity can thrive and how different species can persist across landscapes. And one of the things that is a recurrent theme in ecological research is how, by connecting different patches of large habitats, like for example that hill over there, how can we enhance biodiversity by connecting those patches through like smaller corridors, like for example this coppicing initiative here. We can make these habitats connected and therefore facilitate the dispersal of the different species. So I think that these projects like this that connect different urban or different natural areas across different urban gradients are really important for facilitating this movement of species and ultimately make biodiversity better at the urban and also more natural landscape.
One of the interesting aspects is the elimination. So by coppicing, we have eliminated a invasive species. Knotweed had just started to creep into the edges of the coppice, and since we coppiced it, the wildflowers have come back and that knotweed has completely disappeared. As we've kind of crowded it out, given the native plants more space to take back their territory, they've kind of pushed out the knotweed once more. That eliminates any need for us to spray it. So why in Wales do we have so many hedges and so many coppices? People tend to think hedgerows are ancient, and some of them are. Some of them go back to Roman times. The planting of hedgerows is a much more recent story around kind of enclosure, and particularly parliamentary enclosure in the late 18th century. And that's where most of about 50% of our hedges really were planted there then in order to enclose fields so that they could be farmed in a more modern way. The coppicing is, as I said, is a different story, but it's sort of the same story really. Our coppicing history in Wales comes from a time earlier than our hedges, earlier than most of our hedges, in that most of our coppicing was planted for the use of charcoal. And it's really hard now for us to imagine how much charcoal was needed during the early days of the Industrial Revolution. The early days of the Industrial Revolution weren't powered by coal, they were powered by charcoal. Coal had been known and discovered, but it wasn't known how to use it efficiently. So most of the early Industrial Revolution was powered by charcoal, and it takes round about 1 acre of coppiced hazel to feed a ironworks for about an hour. And these things used to run for days on end, 24 hours a day. So much of Wales, any hillside area, south facing, that wasn't used for arable land would have been covered in coppice. And that is quite evident in our historical records that we have. So why do we need to lay hedges now in the city, of all places?
I mean, one of the reasons why we did this project is because we wanted to bring the kind of beauty of these hedges into the city, didn't we? Yeah. And one of the things that astonishes me, and you can really see it well here, is just how beautiful they are as a thing.
You have to work with the resource you've got, and this sort of beach, and it was challenging because it was overstood, quite heavy, so some of the cuts are really big. You can see how big the diameter was. The back was really big, and then the front was a lot thinner. But I got this as close to Brecon style as I possibly could, and the binding technique isn't Brecon. It would have been a single binder behind a single stake if it was Brecon style, but this is closer to the Midland style of binding. But the key with this style of hedge is to build. So you have to build the material to get the desired effect, and which would have been to create a stock-proof barrier. When it's built, you don't just lay one after the other. You offset your work, and you try and, if you like, control the material so it locks behind the stakes well, but creating this nice facade as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things worth saying is this hedge wasn't planted in order to be laid.
True.
So if you'd planted the hedge in order to be laid, you may have planted it slightly differently. You would certainly planted it slightly thicker. But this was just a hedge that was just planted here in order to hide the road behind, right? To give a little bit of a gap between this main road and this main road. But we've seen the opportunity to make it look beautiful.
So this style of hedge laying is completely different to the piece of work that's in front of Landor Social Club. The piece of work at Landor is closer to what the style of hedge laying you find on Gower, and that obviously is just using the resource that comes from the hedge, which is what you'd find on a Gower hedge bank. Whereas this style we did here because of the copper works bringing so many of the farming community down out to the hills and off the farms to work, because the livelihood that was earned here was easier to earn a livelihood in the copper works than it was on the farms back then. We wanted to do a piece of work that honoured the farming communities that came down from the hills. Obviously, people's lives were a lot shorter than working in the copper works. Potentially, people lived longer living on the farms, but when you have a family to feed, farming was really hard. So this piece of work was to honour the farming communities that committed to being here. So this style of hedge laying is closer to the Brecon style, in that it's stake and bound. So there's a stake every metre, and then there's a binder that locks the stakes together. But this hedge is solely beech. There's no other material in here, it's just beech. And it was planted when the Liberty Stadium there was built. So 15 years regrowth. And it's 96 metres, and there's not one stretch of it that's a straight line. So it's curves all the way along.
These hedges, we have to remember, are designed to be laid, and if we don't lay them, they grow out and they cease to exist over time. And we're getting very close to that point now, really. But what we do know about hedges is also that they prevent soil loss and that they reduce pollution and they prevent flooding. And these are all things that we need in the future. And I think for me, one of the most interesting aspects of hedges is the reduction of pollution. So in a recent study, it was found that trees weren't that good at reducing pollution in cities. In Victorian times, the Victorians knew which trees to plant, and they planted big plane trees which have huge leaves. And the reason for that was so that the leaves would take the pollution from the air, fall to the ground, and then you could sweep them up and therefore remove the pollution from the air. Now, with less and less street cleaners and with less and less people employed to do that kind of work, and also with the city trying to save money by planting smaller trees such as silver birch, that's no longer really relevant. But our hedges can actually fill that gap. Our hedges, which tend to be lower than trees, will suck up a lot of pollution and will actually hold on to it. And particularly trees used in hedges such as beech trees. Beech trees, when they're used in hedges, they stay as immature trees. And because they stay as immature trees, they keep their leaves throughout the entire year. And therefore they hold on to the pollution. So we can use the power of our hedgerows in our cities to reduce pollution, to take greenhouse gases out of circulation, store carbon, and prevent soil loss. So in the city, it's very easy to walk past a hedge, maybe an ancient hedge, maybe an ancient hedgerow bank, maybe an ancient hedge that's been there 4, 5, 1,000 years, and never notice it. So I hope by watching this video, by listening to me, the next time you're out there, you might notice it a bit more.